former ABC radio and boycott movement of the event because here you go, it accepted a donation from the Embassy of Israel. Ballard was booked to MC one of the sessions in Sydney Festival's Gala Comedy Night, but yesterday announced his withdrawal from the event, saying on Twitter, "I respectfully ask that the festival review its decision and return the funding in question." He says he, quote, calls on other artists to consider joining this boycott too, unquote. As I said, the festival opens tomorrow, but has suffered from the boycott led by people including journalist Amy Maguire and television personality Nazim Hussain. Now, the festival accepted $20,000 in funding from the embassy to stage Sydney Dance Company performances of the Israeli choreographer Ohad Naharan's work, Decadence at the Opera House, which was to be performed at the festival. You can't help but wonder whether these individuals will now take the same stance, consistency, and boycott any events or any products that might have connections to, let's say, China and the Chinese Communist Party, their continued genocide of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province, for example. Rarely hear that. I want to speak to Dr David Adler, who, aside from being a former Deputy Secretary of the AMA, the Australian Medical Association, is the President of the Australian Jewish Association. He's a medical graduate of the University of New South Wales and an active member of Sydney's Orthodox Jewish community. And Dr David Adler is on the line. Happy New Year to you, Doctor. I trust you're well.
Happy New Year to you, Luke, and good to talk to you.
So I see something like this, and in the little voice inside my large head says, "Here we go again. Now, please be consistent, and if you are concerned about the treatment of others, let's make sure you're concerned about all treatment of all others." But it falls flat. And sadly, this has become a little bit of an issue du jour amongst the arts community, or that's what it feels like. From your point of view, what do you make of all of this?
Look, you're absolutely right, Luke. Firstly, there is no consistency. And if there are about 25 territorial disputes around the world at the moment, only one of them is subject to a comprehensive boycott, divestment, sanction, BDS campaign, and that's against Israel. And you have to conclude that the only thing that distinguishes Israel from many other places around the world that have been involved in conflict and dispute is that it is the only Jewish state in the world. So, not to gloss it, what we're talking about here is anti-Semitism. And who would have thought that in the arts community there are Greens advocates, there are leftists who are anti-Semitic, there are some Islamic extremists if you look down the names, etc. So that's what this is about. It's ugly and it needs to be called out. Now, fortunately, our political leaders in Australia, and from a bipartisan point of view, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have both recently said that they will respect and adopt the most widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And one of the aspects of that, and it's I think why the leftists object to it, is because it does address the question of consistency. You can criticise Israel, the policies of the government or whatever, in exactly the same way as you might criticise any other country that's not regarded as anti-Semitic. But if you hold Israel out to a completely different set of standards, if you distinguish it from every other country in the world for special treatment, which is what the BDS campaign does, then you cross the line into anti-Semitism. It's got a very ugly history. The boycott of Jewish businesses and Jewish products and now we have the Jewish state, of course was something adopted by the Nazis in the lead up to the Second World War in a most horrific way, and we've got to learn the lessons of history as to where that leads.
Indeed we do. A coalition representing Sydney's Arab community has written to the festival's board saying the funding made the event quote-unquote unsafe for people of Arab background. As an active and senior member of the Jewish community, that must really unsettle you. It would me.
Well, it's also rubbish. We have seen during the last couple of years, for example, that within the Arab world, those that are prepared to be reasonable and extend a hand of friendship, Israel reciprocates. In fact, something called the Abraham Accords was signed just a couple of years ago under the Trump administration with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco and with Sudan. They're the first four countries to enter into this set of agreements with Israel. And it's really improved the relationships considerably. There is trade, there's tourism, etc. So that is a much better alternative for those that really want to advocate peace, advocate increasing living standards of those involved. The Arab community in Australia, or at least that part of it that wrote the letter, unfortunately fall into the other side, where we see the jihadists, the extremists, the anti-Semites, those that prefer conflict to peacemaking, and it's very distressing. There is an element of that, unfortunately, in Western countries around the world, and that also needs to be called out vigorously.
Indeed. The festival board chair, David Kirk, released a statement yesterday saying it sees it as, quote, the core of the Sydney Festival to present art and to provide an inclusive platform for all artists, saying we aim to profile a diverse representation of work by artists and companies locally, nationally and internationally. We respect the right of any artist to withdraw from the festival and hope that they'll feel able to participate in future festivals. Of course, there's a longer statement on the festival website. What do you make of that response?
Well, the Sydney Festival Board, to its credit, has not bowed its knee to the BDS movement. It's tried to be as diplomatic as possible. Really, art should be about art. It shouldn't be about politics. And there's an enormous number of collaborations in the artistic field between Jewish artists and Arab artists and various sorts. So I think that the purpose of the Sydney Festival is to be a broad festival. There may well be artists that disagree with each other, but in a mature society, your response should be, so what? You present your act, you present your view, I'll present my act and my view, and it's called a democracy, where various views and styles can be incorporated in the one event. So I commend the Sydney Festival Board for being accommodating, for not crumbling to the political pressure that it's been under.
And just on that, back to that notion of consistency we spoke about at the beginning of this conversation, it strikes me as more than a little odd that more hasn't been said about the attendance of the Winter Olympics in China, given what we know is the appalling treatment of the Uyghurs, something that's happening right now. How can we, my personal view is, why would we send our team there, even though for the athletes it's horribly unfair, and I take that on board, but how can we in any way be seen to be supporting anything China does? Well,
look, it'd be a very interesting question to put to the same Arab group, and the bulk of Arabs, of course, are Muslims. It is their brethren which is suffering the most in China. Over 1 million of them locked up in what really is some form of concentration camp, although the Chinese like to call it re-education camp. There's been evidence of absolutely appalling treatment, but you don't see any Arab country in the world boycotting China. None. They're quite happy to boycott the Jews, but they won't boycott the country which is doing the most harm to the most Muslims at the moment. And that again reinforces my point that this is really not about art. It's about anti-Semitism. It's about an effort to destroy Israel rather than to make peace and to collaborate. We also have called out the human rights abuses in China. Although every major event is different, and we've got to be a bit cautious in comparing what's happening in China to what happened in the Holocaust, the persecution of a group on a major scale because of their religion or ethnicity or national identity is something the world was supposed to have learnt, the so-called lesson of never again. And the least we can do is to call it out vigorously. Then it becomes to others to decide how to respond. But it's very, very interesting that the Arab and Muslim world has not responded to the persecution of their brethren. And I think that question needs to be asked very loudly, and they need to be challenged as to why not.
Always great to talk to you, Dr. David Adler. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Luke, and hopefully 2022 will be a better year than 2021 for all of us.
We can only hope, David. Thank you so much. President of the Australian Jewish Association and former Deputy Leader of the AMA, that is Dr. David Adler. David, I wish you well. Thanks so much.